All right, guys, I'm going live here about a minute early, just kind of wanting to make sure everything's working out. I always appreciate everybody getting on, as many people as do seem to get signed up to get on early. It's always impressive to me how many people watch these live streams. And today is going to be another Ask Me Anything day. And so I hope I hope that you have lots of good questions, and I will do my best to answer those questions as we proceed today. Just real quick as we go, I'm going to try to do a couple more live streams, one a week between now and Christmas. I'm not sure how the schedule will work out later on towards the end of the month. I am interested in your feedback if you guys have recommendations or suggestions on how I could maybe do this better. I'm also curious to see if what your thoughts are as far as topics of discussion, or if maybe we should have some of these live streams where we kind of focus on a specific topic. There was a question brought up about bringing in having like a special to Second Amendment kind of focused event, and I'm happy to do that as well. But I'm looking for feedback on these live streams, because I know that even though I did my first one a little while ago, there was some. I'm always curious about doing a little bit better. So I have to confess, I'm not somebody that watches a lot of live streams myself. And so as a content provider, I guess is probably the proper term here, I'm not usually, since I'm not a consumer as much, I'm just simply trying to do what I think people might be interested in hearing and what you might want to know. And I'm always looking for that feedback, and it does matter to me quite a bit. So again, there were a couple little things I wanted to make sure that I addressed today, just because of what's gone on in the last week. Just to give you a little bit of a preview on a couple of videos that I did film today, one of which I hope to launch tomorrow, is one of them is going to be about just the complete and total meltdown that we're witnessing just kind of across the spectrum right now with leftists and the whole political class over these initiatives that have been submitted, the initiative signatures that were submitted recently by Let's Go Washington. It actually was it's very instructive to see just what kind of a panic that has been induced by those and the way that they're reacting to it, and it's fairly extreme. My video, I address some of these issues, and it's always a question as to whether in that relatively short period of time, whether I adequately address some of those issues. But there's, I'd like to just kind of discuss this a little bit more, because I think the average person doesn't quite realize how much of our tax dollars, either through grant grifting operations or jobs programs or whatever, gets filtered out directly to these left-wing kind of advocacy sort of operations in our state. And it doesn't matter what kind they are, whether it's homeless industrial complex stuff, environmental stuff, just simply jobs programs, no-show jobs at some of these local government and state agencies. For political people, so that they can kind of still be full-time political people, but theoretically working for the agencies. How campaign contributions are oftentimes recycled through Department of Commerce grants, or all kinds of grants actually that go out from the state, whether it's federal pass-through dollars, whether it's state dollars, whether it's local dollars that kind of recycle and mix these together and go out. There's an expectation that campaign contributions, or certainly campaign support, comes back from the groups that receive that money. There's all kinds of stuff like that happens out there, and I think the average person, certainly the average person who lives in our community, has no idea just how corrupt that whole process really is. And so when you have initiatives, which 4 of the 6 initiatives that Let's Go Washington has proposed, clearly cut down on the taxes, the tax dollars that get fed into this kind of grant grifting operation. And some of the protesters that were there at this group, they're coming from some of these organizations that directly or indirectly are actually getting a lot of support, one way or another, that comes from the very taxes that they don't want cut. So this is kind of creating that whole challenge that I know I've discussed before on previous live streams. And it's a distributed cost, concentrated benefits challenge that those of us who care about liberty and freedom, and those of us who want smaller government and more localized control over issues, one of the things that I think sometimes people fail to realize is that there is a concentrated benefit that directly goes to people who are recipients of the grants or the grant funding or the contracts, or in some other way largesse that comes out of government. And the decisions on where that money gets sent regardless of whatever type of edifice has been created that makes it seem like there's some kind of a merit-based process. That edifice really just simply conceals the fact that that money typically goes to entities and organizations who may or may not be competent at all in doing whatever they promised to do in exchange for the grant money. But one thing they must be is politically pure. They must be politically supportive of the people who are kicking the cash out to them. They must kick back some campaign contributions one way or another, or support for the person's campaign. SEIU does this all the time with the grants that simply expand and require people to have those union workers provide in-home healthcare services, for example, just so that SEIU can siphon that money to themselves, and in turn they exclusively and almost entirely fund Democrats throughout the state. This is done all kinds of areas. I mean, SEIU is the obvious one, but the WEA does the same thing, which is the Washington Education Association. All these different organizations, that's how the process works. So for them, it is an existential threat to their very existence, or certainly the cash flow that they live on. If those tax dollars are reduced in any way at all, it has a substantial impact on them. Even if they're not sure that that tax dollar is going to come out of their pocket specifically immediately, they're concerned about the Hunger Games sort of musical chair problem that gets created when there's just not enough tax dollars flowing, and all the grifters are going to have to fight over the remaining tax pool that they have there. And so that's not what they want to deal with, and so they are very much threatened by it. Whereas the average citizen, who has to pay higher gas taxes, in the example of the carbon tax scheme, it's an indulgence, essentially, if you're familiar with medieval history, where the church used to basically allow people, pay an indulgence for your sins. It's like it was one of the reasons why Martin Luther rebelled against the Catholic Church back in the kind of Protestant Reformation, was about this abuse of this indulgence process. Well, essentially, all the carbon taxes is an indulgence scheme that people who supposedly are polluting, kicking out CO2, that those businesses simply have to pay to pollute, essentially is what it is. And so presuming that CO2 is even pollution in the first place, then what they need to do is pay, and that money creates this big slush fund that the governor and a variety of insider political people can use to simply, in turn, kick it out to their friends, who conveniently will be the same people that send money back to their political campaigns or who support them politically. It's a very corrupt kind of cycle, but that's a lot of money. It's $1.5 billion just in the first year of operation. Just this big slush fund. That's a lot of money, even in Washington state. And so they find ways of kicking this around. Well, that buys you a lot of friends and a lot of political influence. When that spigot is threatened to be shut off, those people getting that cash, they are committed to doing anything they can to keep the cash flow going. The average citizen, though, you're just paying higher gas taxes, and it sucks, and it hurts people a lot. When you have to pay higher fees, if you have to pay more for propane, if you have to pay more for heating, natural gas coming to your house. And remember, Bob Ferguson threatened the utilities and told them that they could not reveal how much they were having to increase their fees to the average homeowner because, as a result of this this climate tax proposal thing that Inslee shoved through. It's just a scam. It's a con. But the average citizen who does pay a lot more for that, do they have the resources to push back on it? Well, they don't if they're threatened or they're harassed or they're sued. And so the average person just takes the hit and suffers as a result of these tax increases. But so they're usually, the average citizen's not willing to actually take the heat or do the effort or even have the resources to necessarily push back on this kind of a scheme. Those of us who end up doing it or trying to push back hard, we're the ones threatened with litigation and all kinds of other threats that come out of this grant grifting operation world, because for them, this concentrated benefits challenge, concentrated benefits, distributed costs, concentrated benefits for them mean that there's literally nothing they won't do to make sure that gravy train keeps coming. Same with the capital gains tax, same with any kind of new tax or fee scheme that they come up with. It's all about keeping the gravy train rolling. and they're threatened right now. And they're threatened not just in one area, they're threatened in multiple areas based on the Let's Go Washington signature drive and the initiatives that it appears to be likely that are going to be on the ballot in 2024. And I say appears to be likely is that I would say that this first one that was submitted, they had way more than enough signatures. And if I'm understanding correctly the way that they're validating the signatures before they even turn them in, they know the duplications, they know how many registered voters have signed, they have a pretty good sense of the accuracy of the signatures that they've turned in. And so it seems to me very likely that that when you turn in 419,000 or 418,000 and you need 325,000, that math simply means that even though you'll have some that are problems, it's not going to be enough to change the overage. And so it's very likely that that initiative is going to be on the ballot. Well, they still have to turn in 5 more. I'm being told that it looks like they're going to turn in all 5. And so if that happens over the next few weeks, then what'll happen is you're going to have 6 initiatives, up to 6 initiatives that'll be on the ballot next November. That's a big deal. I think it's a big deal anyway. And they know it's a big deal because if you plan on scheming and taking that cash for yourself and then in turn using it to fund those political people who got you that cash, it kind of shakes up the plan if it looks like you're going to have the cash flow shut off. So the meltdown is a big deal. The other thing that I did a video on real quick was short video on a records request that was filed with the Yakima mayor. Some of you might remember I did this video where I played her 911 call. And she was very angry that 911 call came out there. And some of the email exchanges or text message exchanges, because a variety of people filed records requests on her cell phones because she clearly was using her personal cell phone to do public work. And those records requests came back, and one of them in there was like an attorney trying to help the mayor try to come up with some way of litigating against me, filing a lawsuit against me, as some other attorneys that were talking to her. And they were saying that there's a lot of attorneys a lot of lawyers, I think is what they said, a lot of lawyers hate Glen Morgan, or hate Morgan is what they said. So anyway, I shared the text messages in this other video and just talk about it. And it was kind of interesting and funny for me to watch. So with that, if you have your questions, send them in, and I will do my best the best I can anyway, to try to answer your questions. And let me know if you have any suggestions for how to make this show format more interesting, or it's something that you would like to see that I'm not doing right now. So let me talk. So one of the first questions that came up here, Karen, you actually left this question on before I even got the live stream going here today, which is, what's your thoughts on the Byrd-Reichert debate? And are Ari and Brandy left-wing nutcases? Well, I'll answer that second question first. No, they're not. No, they aren't left-wing nutcases. Ari's great. I've been on Ari's show. I've known him since before he had a radio show, when he was just an activist in Seattle. He's a great guy doing good work and exposing the things the left certainly doesn't want you to see about Seattle. And Brandy is also somebody I've really appreciated. I've had a lot of conversations with her. She actually interviewed me not recently, but I think it's been a couple months now on her show. And so if you want to see a long-form interview of me, that would be probably one that you could go watch. And they're not nutcases. Here's what I know about the Byrd-Reichert debate. And debate might be a strong term for it. Maybe it would be more accurate to just say that it would be a format for people to see the two candidates together. But let me just talk about this a little bit. Because in a way, I kind of feel like this was something that got blown a little bit out of proportion. I have, in the past, moderated debates between politicians numerous times. I mean, I've done it even back when I was at the Freedom Foundation years ago. We felt that there wasn't enough attention given to things like auditor or treasurer or secretary of state. And so we actually had hosted a debate series that we did around the state at the time. Spokane, Seattle, and Vancouver is kind of how I remember it. And I was involved in helping organize those debates. And there's kind of a classic format that you want to go through when you're trying to highlight it, because frankly, people running for those types of positions, they get very little exposure in the media. And so the average citizen has no idea who's actually running for office. So that was and also I remember organizing debates even back when I was in college, when I was in the College Republican. So that was back in the day, right? So I think a debate is an important opportunity for people who actually care about the politicians or who they're going to elect in those offices to at least see them in a different format that's not a predictable canned campaign speech event. So there's a little bit more compare and contrast opportunities, I think, that exist for people. I like debates. What I don't like is the mudslinging pointless way that, for instance, the Republican National Committee seems to have these debates were hosted by NBC. The moderators are horrific and embarrassing, and clearly don't care at all about the issues that matter to the people who are going to vote in the Republican primary. So instead, they spend all the time talking about finding ways to pit these candidates to yell at each other. I don't like being in a debate like that, and as a moderator, I think that's a dishonest way to operate when you're trying to run a debate and trying to moderate a debate like that. So what I have found, and I participate in debates when I've been the person either on issues a couple times, and I've also been, when I was a candidate, occasionally I was involved in a couple debates back in the day. So debates are good. And I think there's a hunger for them even more now than ever. But when the Pierce County Republicans had been wanting to put together a debate, and they're pretty well organized in Pierce County, and it makes sense. And so they wanted to have a Republican gubernatorial debate. And at this point in time, there's only 2 Republican candidates who are running. And so they were going to have Reichert and Byrd there. I don't think the format, I agreed to be moderator. So that's absolutely true. I did. But I wasn't talking a lot about it because my experience has been you can set your calendar up months in advance, but things change as you get closer. So venue might change, the time start. I don't even think the time had been set yet. But there was a debate format, and I agreed to moderate it. And I'd been told that I was considered an acceptable moderator by both campaigns, which I appreciate. I haven't come out and endorsed anybody in the governor's race or any races, actually, I think, that are going to be on the ballot next year at all. So that makes it so, it's less likely, at least the perception is going to be, it's less likely that I'm going to be biased. And really, I just like the idea of people being able to explain to the public, particularly Republican candidates who are going to be ignored by the traditional media mostly. They get to they get to present themselves there. There is a format that I actually kind of like, and we had talked about this kind of format, which was that maybe what you would have is a debate where you create 5 or 6 scenarios. You're governor of Washington State. This scenario happens. What do you do? And I like that because that gives the candidate the opportunity to simply explain how they would address certain types of situations in a way that I think people get a better sense of who they are. It also is a little bit less about trying to mudsling against each other, in a way that's fairly pointless and not terribly productive. So that was my thought process on some ideas, but the truth is it wasn't totally set in stone. I had talked, I think, briefly to Ari, but not with any detail about also being a co-moderator. I actually think Ari would be a good moderator in this type of scenario. So, but things are not set in stone yet. It's become a bigger drama than it needs to be. And I think Byrd had talked about this debate and put it out there. I think that was fair. The date was kind of set down. Probably might have been a little bit more efficient to just talk to the Republicans, wait until they come out with it first, and then come out with your own statement about it. But regardless, it is what it is. I think there was a little bit of an overreaction to it. The fact that somebody there was discussion about this debate, but it wasn't yet obvious. The time wasn't set yet, et cetera. But regardless, we seem to be creating drama where there is really no drama. I hope that there's a debate. If that debate doesn't happen or that schedule's not going to be set up, I hope that there's another debate. I'd love to be a moderator, but I don't have to be. Somebody else can do it. I would just like to have a debate between Republican candidates, at least enough that you can see the difference between where they stand and who they are and what their issues are. And for governor, God's sake, we need Ferguson is it's like the agent of Satan, coming along who wants to be governor. And so it'd be nice if we could see who some of these other people are running for office. And so I'd like to see a debate coming up before too long. Cristiano, you said King County just certified the election, but does it really matter now? Well, it always matters, and I do want to go back and do a story about some of the King County elections and the final results on some of those. I haven't done that yet, and your question kind of reminds me that I need to get to that. So hopefully I can do that. Let's see. Hi, Glenn. I got a dismissal from the emailed you about. They admit he was involved in contracts in the complaint. Okay, I'll have to follow up with you on that specifically. Sounds like something pretty specific to a records request you did, and one that I kind of remember that we talked about. Let's see. The reason problems never get solved. This is funny from Ellen. The reason problems never get solved is that it dries up the cash cow, and that's absolutely true. If you want to understand why the homeless industrial complex will absolutely never solve homelessness, and in fact, the more money they get, the worse it's going to get by a long way. So it's not even a little bit. It's going to get substantially worse, and you have drug addiction and more crime than ever, is that they realize that if they solve the problem, they potentially put their money at risk. And the worse the problem gets, the more grant money they believe they can get. And so far, that's been true. So that's why you're going to see that kind of stuff happening. Alien Paul, you're asking, Glenn, can we force the government to stop mail-in ballots and go vote in person? The answer to that, short answer is no. About you being able to force the government to do that. The longer answer is a little different. There's a number of things that could happen that would drive us to go to in-person voting. And I kind of want to talk about this a little bit because it comes up a lot. And because I do the Washington Voter Research Project, which is I'm threatening, people are threatening to sue me for a lot of different reasons. And that's one that I seem to get a lot of common threats on. How dare you look at the voter rolls or try to make it possible for people to know what's going on in the voter rolls? That's apparently really a verboten task. But the process of recognizing that there's challenges in the existing election process and that we need to do some work to fix it is, I think, fairly well known out there. Why that's become a partisan thing is simply a result of how certain elections have gone at the national level. The Democrats, when they like it, then they don't want to question elections. When they don't like it or when they're concerned about it, they do question elections. There's a whole YouTube video actually of 20 minutes of Democrats questioning the integrity of elections just recently. Or a few years ago now. And then once an election went their way, they no longer are allowed to actually have those questions anymore. And so that video has actually it's one of the videos that I think YouTube has decided to ban because you're not allowed to ask questions about elections. So let's talk about the election process, which is wonkish generally when you're really digging into it. And the question of in-person and mail-in voting. Mail-in voting clearly provides more opportunities for bad things to happen, if for no other reason than because the chain of custody and the lack of validity of validation that it's actually the voter who fills out that ballot. In fact, there's no way to validate that at all. The last very small thin veneer of check is that maybe the signature matching process is set up okay where you live, and they can at least validate that the signature matches. But in practice, that's a very poor substitute for any kind of real validation. So mostly it's just a guesswork, patchwork, mystery, magical box of electioning, and hopefully it all works out as well, and hopefully fraud is just too difficult to process. And trust us, we just know what's going on. That's generally the approach. I do need to explain, though, in-person voting doesn't somehow magically vanish all concerns that people would have about manipulation of the election process. People have been cheating at elections for millennia. In fact, since the concept of an election was created, the idea of how to cheat in an election was probably created shortly at the same time, I bet simultaneously. So the idea that somehow that elections are going to be pure and free from problems is probably that's a utopian hope, and we all would aspire to be there, but it's not going to probably happen. So what you do is you build two things into the election process to make it more acceptable, because if it's honest and accurate, then the theory is that at least people would recognize that it's an acceptable process for choosing political leadership or policy changes in the case of initiatives and things like that. So one of the ways you do that is you make it very transparent. It's harder to cheat when things are transparent. It just is. Transparency is a legitimate way to help maintain the view that everybody can check and see, is this election transparent? And if it's transparent, it's a lot harder to cheat. The second thing is the trust but verify process, which is that we're going to make sure these are real people. I know I've told the story before, but I'll repeat it again. Out of Northern Ireland, when they believed there was a lot of election fraud going on and fluffy voter rolls and bad behavior by both sides of the political process up there, which was more of a Catholic versus Protestant sort of argument. At least that was a baseline kind of way that people were dividing themselves on these political lines. There was a general view that the elections were filled with a lot of fraud. And so one of the things they did is they cracked down on the voter rolls. overnight the voter rolls dropped by about 11%. And it was widely viewed that that was roughly the margin of bad votes that were occurring in the election process in Northern Ireland, roughly in that amount. Years later, people did come forward and admit that they had been involved in election fraud teams that basically would use fake ID and it disguises and everything, and they would drive around in-person voting to polls that, on election day, and different vans and do different things and wear, fake IDs and all this stuff. And then that's one of the ways that they would fluff up the voter roll. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, some risk. So when they cracked down and made it that a lot harder, it appears that most of that kind of went away. And one of the concerning trends that's gone on with mail-in voting is that it's not just that you have mail-in voting, it's that everything related to the election process that was normally a public record in the past is being rapidly restricted so that there's no way to have transparency on what actually is going on in the election process. And so I'm always going to be resistant to that trend. Like, for instance, and this started back in it was the White lawsuits that happened at the time, but the lawsuits that occurred, it was a series of lawsuits against a variety of counties back in 2011, I think, through 14, somewhere in that time frame. I might be wrong on the dates. And they basically, the court, in its infinite wisdom, decided that ballots were no longer a public record, which is terrible, because if you have no way of ever getting and looking at those original ballots, you have no way of actually knowing that the way they're cast, the way they've been reported to have been cast, is actually the way they were written. And there's a lot of things you can learn from ballots, from reviewing original ballots. And so I think that that's an example of going in the wrong direction of transparency. And so it's one of the reasons why we're pushing back on a lot of these restrictions that have been pushed by the political insider class, under the belief that apparently if they feel like they like the results of the election right now, then there's no reason to ever question them. And if they don't like the results, suddenly they'll discover election integrity again in the future. It's a terrible thing that's going on right now. I don't know that I answered that question. I felt like I went way far astray from that one. Let's see. So I guess going back to that question that Alien and Paul had asked, there's three different ways that I could see you getting to the process of going back to voting in person in Washington State. The first and most likely way would just be if mail-in voting was determined at a federal level to be a dishonest way or inaccurate way or ineffective way or inconsistent way of voting. And if they ever decide that federally, which there's other states where this type of thing is being debated, if they ever made that decision, then that could change how election voting, mail-in voting is done in our state. The second way of doing it is if for some reason you did have a majority in the legislature, they could change the law, of course, and you could go back to in-person voting. And the third way is probably sort of related to that, which is if you could do an initiative that really specifically pushed that issue. I've polled on this issue a few times in the past and been involved in a couple polling efforts, and it doesn't poll well yet in Washington to change mail-in voting. People like mail-in voting because it's convenient, even Republicans. It's a smaller percentage. The percentages are dropping as far as how people like it. But anyway, that's one of those issues that you should be aware of. Ellen had a question here. What are the realistic chances of turning the state red with continued exclusive mail-in voting? Sort of related to the question that we already had there. Okay, now this is an interesting question because people do ask this a lot. And it's a funny perspective. And I want to say, it's funny to me only because it seems to be uniquely from the conservative side, liberty side of the equation, where there's this belief that once an environment, wherever it happens to be, gets run by leftists or Democrats in some way, that there's no going back, that it's just a hopeless cause and it's the end of the world. It's the end. And I think that that's just an inaccurate, ineffective way of looking at how elections truly work. I believe that if the elections are reasonably honest and reasonably accurate, eventually Democrats and socialists have historically done dumb things and that drive their community to voting for somebody else or voting for change, real change. Cyclically, that's how elections have operated in the past. And trust me, our country has had problems with corrupt election voting for over 150 years. You can go back. There's plenty of examples. Tammany Hall in New York, the Reconstruction South. There's all kinds of examples of bad and corrupt voting practices that have been done in the past and used in the past. So So the idea of that fraud is suddenly new is wrong. However, I personally lived in New York City, and I remember what it was like to have Giuliani running for. I was there in college, and what happened when he decided to run for mayor, and he lost the first time, and he won overwhelmingly the second time, and the significance of that cannot be understated. In New York City at the time, there were hardly any Republicans. I mean, it was like 15%, 19% Republicans at the most. And Giuliani was running as a Republican, for God's sake, against an incumbent Democrat, who was terrible. Of course, Dinkins was a terrible mayor, probably one of the worst that New York's ever had. But he was a typical Democrat in his policies. There really wasn't anything unique about his policies that were particularly bad. It was just that the voters of New York had finally had enough, and they decided they needed somebody new, and Giuliani was the right person at the right time. And in his heyday, he was an amazing mayor, at least particularly when it came to dealing with crime, which is, I think, his signature achievement in New York, because under his leadership, clearly, New York City had the greatest drop in violent crime ever recorded in any urban city ever in the history of America. So that was a pretty big deal. And not that long ago, 2004, when he got elected. Or, sorry, 1994 when he got elected. So, when we look at part of the question here about what are the realistic chances to turn the state red, I would say that they're fairly high, but it does depend. Part of the challenge I think that activists have is that we tend to, and I think this is a mistake, this is just personal philosophy issue here. Being engaged in the political process means that you have to be involved in political parties. You do. And I'm a Republican PCO where I live in Thurston County. I ran the College Republicans when I was in New York City, living there as a college student. I've ran as a Republican in the past for office, and I'm involved in some Republican Party stuff. I don't hold any significant positions of leadership, and I don't plan to. But I don't think that means that you put your entire faith in a political party to achieve the political goals that you end up having in the community. It's mostly just a way of identifying and organizing to pick your candidates and to keep things going there. But my experience has been that partisan politics is kind of weak at times in resolving. It tends to create like a lot of drama. There's a lot of personal drama that ends up coming out in the political process and the political parties. By the way, it's not unique to Republicans. If you've ever gone to a Democrat PCO event, and I recommend you do if you can, you'll watch astounding levels of stupid infighting there, just like you'll see that sometimes at Republican events. So there's nothing particularly unusual about it. It's sort of the nature of man, and politics in particular tends to concentrate people into one room who have strong feelings about things and bring a lot of political sort of drama with them when they come to these events and activities. And so it makes it very hard for them to be a perfectly perfect process of prevailing and achieving the political goals that you may have in your community. I actually believe you can accomplish quite a bit outside of the political party, and it doesn't mean that you don't do anything in the party. It just means that you do something outside of it that is something that you can focus on and you care about. I like property rights, Second Amendment rights, the right to keep and bear arms, First Amendment issues. These are affinity groups that don't necessarily have a partisan focus, but allow you to actually create more long-term, consistent, unified messaging on a couple of these issues you can stay engaged and involved in. By the way, this is nothing particularly unique to the conservative movement. The leftists do the same thing. They have their, trans radical witch groups, right? And their pro-criminal groups. And they have the enviro groups. And they have the homeless industrial complex groups. And all these different groups have probably a lot more power than the local Democrat Party actually does as well. And so they're able to push their agenda and their issues. And so on the freedom liberty side of things, we still need to do the same thing. And not, I think you put your feet in both camps a little bit, one in the political camp, but also out here in the policy issues and what you're trying to achieve. The thing that I think sometimes gets lost is this red team, blue team sort of argument, binary because you really only have two parties, but this idea that my team good, your team bad, and if you lose sight of the issues and why you're even involved in the political process in the first place, those should be your priority. The political party should be lower than that. And what you're trying to do is influence your party to push those policies or whatever your belief system is. Hopefully, you care about the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or the property rights or whatever it is, and then that's what helps drive you. Very generic, and it's more of a philosophy question here, but I hope that I'm helping a little bit of this. Let's see. How do we think? Okay, sorry. Cristiano, you had a question here. Thank you, guys. If you say @We the Govern, by the way, it's just easier for me to find the questions there. And it does make that process just a little bit easier. Any comments on the guy wearing the funny hat, Pope, saying the Catholic Church will bless same-sex union? Well, Cristiano, to be fair, I'm not Catholic. A lot of my family is. I'm not. And I don't have really much in the way of comments on him. I did notice that. I will say that I think the current Pope is probably very lefty-leaning liberal, and that's a disappointment because the Catholic Church has had some popes who were very conservative and I think pushed good, freedom-oriented sort of policies in the past, and the current one doesn't seem to be interested in doing that right now. Julie Anderson, you had a question about how do we thank Brian Haywood for the initiatives, I'm assuming. And that's a good question. I would definitely send the Let's Go Washington people an email and ask them. But I would go to tell you, if you haven't signed the initiatives yet, I'm sure that's probably what he would want more than anything else. Even though it looks really good on all of these initiatives, they're still collecting signatures all the way to the end, mainly for the buffer benefits. You're going to get a benefit of the additional extra signatures that you turn in beyond what the Secretary of State mandates or what the law mandates, just so that it builds a buffer in case that you have problems with duplicates or registered voters or the Secretary of State playing games. So the more of those you get in there, would be better than anything else. Otherwise, I think just spread good words about the initiative. I'm sure he's going to want to ask people to vote for him next November, and so I think that would be good enough. But send him a thank you note. Never hurts. An email. I'm assuming that he gets those when you send those to Let's Go Washington. Jason Fisher had a question. When you going on Todd Herman show, will Sideshow Bob debate, or will he do the hide in the basement strategy? Jason, good question. I would guess that Bob Ferguson is going to basically avoid, like the plague, being on any super safe media campaign. The funny thing is, something came up. I was just reminded of this recently. I'm involved in the agriculture community quite a bit. I'm in the Farm Bureau, but I've been around a lot of farmers for a long time, not just growing up that way, but also my property rights stuff. And one of the things that was funny about Bob Ferguson, is I believe it was him that had reached out, and he was trying to find farmers that he could go and use their farm as a backdrop for a campaign commercial that he probably wanted to film. And he was having a hard time because basically he's done anything and everything he can to harm agriculture and farmers at any opportunity he takes. And so it was just a stupid Patokum sort of fake village that he kind of wanted to get set up, and there was not very many people wanted to host him. I'm sure they'll find some lefty somewhere that does, but it's just kind of a silly thing. Jason, you had let's see, Day at Dawn, sorry, you had a question. Need to clear out the voter rolls. It would be a terrible idea to clear all rolls and have everyone re-register. To register, it literally takes a couple minutes. I'm assuming that's what you meant there. What you'd have to watch out for on that, it has to do with the 1993 motor voter federal law about voter registration, and that's really the one that you need to work around in how you clear the voter rolls out. We have talked about doing what it would be like to do, keep the voter rolls clean. I don't think you have to clear them all, but one of the things you could do is just have a re-registration every 4 years. Which is not overly onerous any more than it is getting your driver's license. And I think in doing that, because essentially you're doing the same thing when you get your driver's license, but when you're doing that, I think that that would help clean up a lot of the problems that we do find with fluffy voter rolls. Jason, you had a question, not a political question here. In your opinion, which is the best first handgun, the M&P 9mm or the Glock 19? Honestly, I would say the Glock 19 is always going to be, it's a pretty easy first handgun for somebody to have. I like 45 better than 9mm. That's just me, but I'm probably old school when it comes to that. Gordon Claxton, Glen, are you looking into Pierce County Auditor Linda Farmer's job performance? I haven't been looking specifically at her job performance. I did note that she violated campaign finance laws, and there's a current investigation against her. for some campaign finance violations that I had filed that complaint on a while ago. So I'm sure that she seems to be a perennial problem, so it'll be interesting to see where she goes. I'm sorry that she's the one who's in charge of Pierce County elections. Doesn't bode well, and she doesn't seem to be very competent. Edward asking the question here, do you think things will eventually get violent? Not condoning, just a statement of fact. Actually, it's a question. Listen, you always have the potential for violence, and I'm assuming when you're talking about violence, you're more talking about political violence, which is a terrible road to go down, and one that should be resisted with every fiber in our being. Political violence becomes a road that you don't come back from, not for a generation or more, and it's a nightmare if it ever happens. Our country's had political violence before. I think for people to whitewash history, which is unfortunately what I think's happened in our country, and I'm not talking just about the Civil War, but political violence has popped up occasionally in the country. If anybody studies the anarchist movement in America around the late 1800s, early 1900s, you'll see a lot of political assassinations that occurred back then, bombs that were set off, genuine terrorism sort of events that occurred on a regular basis for quite a while, over many years, spread all over the country. And political violence has been a feature at times in American history. It hasn't been as much lately. The 1960s had some political violence that bled into the 70s. But it was way worse, actually, I think, when you go back and you look 100 years ago. The challenge today, of course, is that with the ability to communicate instantaneously everywhere, lots of information, I think you have the ability to create more widespread political violence now than you would have been in the past in some ways. And so I think it's foolish for people to think that somehow that political violence is going to be the goal or going to achieve the goal that you think it will. The left has always believed this. There's always been this revolutionary angle that leftists have always had about overthrowing the establishment or destroying the society or something, with this belief that the revolutionaries or whoever it is that's going to come in, that they're going to be the ones who end up on top. The history has never been kind to revolutionaries in that situation, going back to the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution and any of these sorts of revolutions, whether in collectivist revolutions, whatever they might be. Usually those who are the ones that take over are the first ones to get wiped out by the revolution. It's just the history and the nature of violent political activity, and it doesn't tend to work too well. The American Revolution in itself is actually a pretty unique situation when it comes to that. But even there, if you look at the original signers of the Declaration of Independence, many of them ended up dying in the war or losing everything. I mean, there's sacrifice for being people who are involved in it. And for some reason, there seems to be this utopian view that a lot of people have that the left has always had this, but increasingly I'm finding people on the liberty, even on the liberty of freedom side, who believe that for some reason that's going to produce good outcomes, and it won't. So we want to avoid that. And as much as possible, it's worth every bit of effort that we have to solve things peacefully and to solve our political differences in a peaceful manner. And I'm always going to advocate for that as long as I'm able to be involved or still on the air until they totally censor me off. So hopefully that doesn't happen anytime soon. What do you think about the court decision to allow for legislative communications to remain privileged information? This is Arsenio. I'm not familiar with which court decision you're talking about, so maybe I'm out of the loop on this one. Legislative communication, remember, has been open to the Public Records Act at the state level now for a number of years, and at the local level it's been open to the public since 1972. So I'm not totally sure which court decision you're talking about. So if there was a fight that was still going on over that, I'm kind of curious about it to see, because it might be a little bit more narrow than I'm understanding from that question. Jason, it looks like there's only 5 legal semi-autos in Washington, legal only because they feed through, or they fell through the cracks. Will this make it easier to challenge, or will they say 5 is good enough? I don't know. I mean, we'll have to see. There's still so much to learn from, and I don't know how to get on top of that. Arsenio, you had a question here. Did you hear about the attempt by the Tumwater City Council to make all public spaces open to encampments? Arsenio, I'd heard about that. I didn't think that it succeeded. So if it has succeeded, I'd like to know. My impression was that the Tumwater Police Department was strongly opposed to that. They've historically been. And the Tumwater City Council has generally been reluctant to follow Olympia down the yellow brick road of homeless encampments and drug addicts everywhere. It flows into Tumwater from Olympia, of course, but they've typically not gone that way. I do know that they're dominated mostly by lefty Democrats right now, so maybe they are deciding to set themselves on fire, but that hasn't been, self-immolation has not been what the Tumwater City Council's typically done, so we'll see about what happens. Edward, you had a question here. Do you believe the rumor of Ferguson's Book of Revenge? Yes, I do, because I've talked to people who've seen it. And, of course, Ferguson denies that he has it when I filed the records request on him, and I just don't know why. He doesn't like me. Let's see. How can we okay, TZ, a question here. And, by the way, I saw TZ, you had some of the comments. They weren't questions, though, earlier. How can we legally go after cities who allow homeless encampments? It looks like Burien has been pretty successful at stopping encampments. Yes, good point, actually. Burien's done this mainly because, at least this is my opinion. I mean, Burien, and by the way, I mean, some of the crazies did not do well in the election in Burien recently. So I think that I mean, Crystal Marks, thank God, isn't going to be in the city council there, and some other people, Cindy Moore, I think, didn't do well. So anyway, Burien has had an active citizen engaged group that's been opposed to the homeless camps and the drug addict operations and the grifting operations that support them for quite some time. And they're right next to Seattle. So if there's any place that has a massive amount of pressure on them, it's definitely Burien. And you've seen Dow Constantine, the King County Executive Director, engage directly in Burien elections. You've seen Bob Ferguson try to engage directly in elections. Inslee's been involved. I mean, the entire state pressure has come down to turn Burien into a mini-me of Seattle and absorb the nightmare that Seattle's turned itself into with the drug addiction and their homeless junkie camps there. And so they've been wanting to export those. Now they've succeeded, they being the Seattle establishment, has succeeded in exporting quite a few outside of the city. They've exported them to Tukwila, Kent, Federal Way, Renton, all over the state, Linwood, Edmonds, places like that. However, it's not been as successful as the Seattle establishment wants. And so there's continually pressure, bribery, we'll give you this much money, we'll buy this hotel for you, whatever the story is. Burien has generally been has suffered for this, of course, and has been pushing back on it. And I think the people who are engaged there politically deserve a lot of credit for sticking to it. This isn't the kind of thing that you just have some Sunday afternoon 2-hour special solution and then all world's problems are solved. It's not how it works. It's never worked that way in the political process. It won't work that way now. It didn't work that way in Burien. They still have a lot of fights going on, a lot of crazies there to deal with, and some entrenched political interests in that city that still are pushing bad ideas. But I think some of their success merits pointing out that they've been successful. Let's see. Don't we need, woke comma asking a question, don't we need organized legal ballot harvesting? Well, I mean, that's something that the Republicans have said that they're going to do. I mean, the left already does that pretty aggressively and has been doing that for a long time. It's essentially been legal for probably 15 years in the state, one way or the other. Certainly since 2011, it's been legal, so that's at least 12 years that you've been able to do ballot harvesting in our state with no legal consequences to it. Other states, that's completely illegal, but in our state, that's legal. So recognizing that's legal, you can still say that you don't like the policy and you want to change the law so that it is illegal. And yet, until then, you have to play on the same playing field that the other side plays on. And so you do and should have some kind of legalized ballot harvesting effort on the conservative freedom side. We're mentally usually not, that is not something that conservatives are comfortable with generally, but it's something they're going to have to be comfortable with because it will make a difference. Ted C., you have a question about that they do recounts by digital ballot image, not hard copy. No, that's not exactly true. I mean, some counties will do that a little bit, but in the last half dozen recounts I've been involved in, hard copy ballots were involved in the process. The digital, when you see them sit down on the clear ballot system and they're looking at the digital screen, generally those are the ones that have some kind of an issue supposedly and they require adjudication, so they say. And so that's a longer conversation, but not necessarily involving the recount process there. Let's see, TZ got a question. Can we audit our elections like Arizona did, or do we have to completely change our government? Ours are not much better than D's. Well, you can audit them, but it's not a very easy process, and it's been made more difficult as time's gone by. So there's a lot of work that has to be done on that. TZ Burton, can we start planting the seeds of precinct election in-person voting paper only, ID, and a voting holiday with hand count of ballots? And who can we pitch this to? Well, technically, we are definitely a state that uses paper ballots because the mail-in voting process, for all of its faults, and there are legion, at least still produces a piece of paper at the end of the day. There are states that allow you to do electronic machine voting that literally has no paper. You have a receipt if you're lucky. And so that's a big deal, and that's a benefit that we would have over that type of voting. But I think that people should stick to paper because of the ability to audit, if no other reason, and to replicate whatever the results were. I like the idea of turning in election day into a holiday. I think we should do that. I like the idea of in-person precinct level or multiple precinct voting, which is how they used to do it, and how much of the country still does it. It is not that hard. India does it that way, for God's sake, which is a bigger country than we are. We can do it. The incompetence and ridiculousness of not having election day but having election month like we do in Washington right now is absurd and embarrassing, and I'd just like to get up to the level of a third world country where we're actually able to vote at least as effectively as they are. Pat, you have a question here. Are we the only ones that would like to see our personal vote counted per issue? All I've been able to see is that our ballots were received. I'm not sure actually what you're saying there. I think that, Pat, you're raising a question, and I'll address it. I think I'm addressing it correctly here. I hope I am. One of the things that has been unsatisfying for mail-in voting and for auditing purposes is that you go look and they say, hey, check to see your status, your ballot online. You go there and all it says is, hey, we received your ballot. The one thing about it that's good is they'll tell you if there's a problem, like they've rejected the ballot for some reason. You can go in and cure it, is the term. They can cure your ballot. Usually it's a signature rejection or there's some other problem. And so you can go in and solve it. You didn't sign. There's usually lack of signature or something else that you can go fix. So, but the other thing people have wanted is a unique ID number of some kind that they could log in and see how their ballot was counted, that would actually come back and feed back to them. Now, the reason why they haven't wanted to do it, at least the excuse that's being used, is that it destroys the privacy of the ballot, private mail, the ability to vote and have nobody know how you're voting. And why that matters is that historically, if people could see how you voted, then the argument was that you would be, and it's a legitimate argument, that you could be influenced and peer pressured into voting against in a way you didn't want to vote, but because you're worried about retaliation or something else. Protecting the integrity and the secrecy of the ballot is an important part of the process. And I agree with that. I think that that's an important part. There's got to be some way that you can go back and verify, or at least have some level of credibility that the way your ballot was counted was the way you filled it out. They are going to resist this hand over fist because it also would lead to potential disputes and issues that I'm sure they don't want to get into. People saying, I mailed that in and that's not how I voted, right? Nevertheless, from a quality control standpoint, I think it's not a bad thing. Even if they just randomly did it with 10% of the voting population in a given cycle, that wouldn't be a bad start, and they could test it out. So I would advocate for that. If the question, Pat, that you had here had more to do with issue-based voting rather than voting on politicians, that's a different issue. Really, issue-based voting is going to be only when you have your local, usually a school or your city decides they want to jack up your taxes and they still want to throw an issue on the ballot, they have you vote on it, or the local politicians have decided that they want to punt on a decision that they would be making, concerned that it would be unpopular, and therefore throw it to the voters so they can vote on it. You'll see that happen sometimes. And then initiatives like what you're seeing with Let's Go Washington coming on the ballot in November. So I like issue voting at times. I think it helps. It provides a little bit more transparency and clarity as to how people feel about different issues. So I think that that's a good idea and a good thing to have happen. There's a question here about. Oh, okay. Somebody just Teddy jumped in here. Yeah. Eric Johnson, 9 million. Okay, yeah, funny, Eric. I like that. I could tell you all about IPSC shooting in 45 versus 9mm, which is a longer conversation. So Jason had a question: Could these be a ballot measure? Could there be a ballot measure to make ballot images public records and make the voting process more open to public records requests? And the answer to that is yes. And that is actually a road that I want to go down to improve transparency and make it more likely that that we could get a better, more of an accurate public clarity as to how elections. We just need more transparency in this whole process, because when the election process loses credibility, it leads to bad things, period. There's nothing good that comes out of that. Beyond the results of the elections, it leads to bad things, and we will really need to address this, I think, in a more serious way. The Democrats have been unwilling to address it because they like the results right now. Once they start to lose some elections, suddenly they'll rediscover election integrity, and that's what I'm hoping to see before too long. Honestly, the best thing that could happen is having a Republican win the president's seat, and suddenly Democrats rediscover the long-forgotten view that there's election problems with the process, and that may be how we get to election integrity at some point. Ted C. You had a question here about Kim Wyman pioneering vote by mail nationally, defended Georgia's recounting irregularities, and joined the Biden administration as civil rights activist. Why is she not considered a Democrat? Well, I mean, listen, people can call themselves whatever political party they want to. Kim Wyman has been a Republican for a long time. I knew her back when she was the auditor in Thurston County and I was running for assessor. She was, to be fair, vote by mail actually began long before Kim Wyman was involved in the political process. It actually started years earlier, really under Ralph Monroe as Secretary of State, also a Republican, and then Sam Reed as a Republican. Really pushed it more aggressively. And it was under Sam Reed's tenure when he was Secretary of State that they actually went to all mail-in voting, and they shut down Pierce County, who was the lone holdout at the end in allowing vote in person. And so it was under when Sam Reed was there is when they did that. But yes, I've disagreed with Kim on her approach to voting to vote by mail. I've actually been on the same page with her when she's resisted some of the changes that the Democrats pushed through the legislature, barely and entirely in a partisan vote, on some of the, like this 17-year-old voter registration and same-day voting and all that stuff. She did testify against that. But I don't know why she would defend Georgia's recounting irregularities, but she did join the Biden administration and obviously jumped out right in the middle of her term, which didn't exactly win her a lot of fans in Washington State. So it is what it is, and she lives back east now. So she doesn't live in Lacey anymore. Jason, you had a question. Could we do a ballot measure to bring the magazine restriction to 15 instead of 10? Or is it a bad idea? I don't know. I mean, you certainly could, but why not go 30, you know? If you went to 30, then, or even 50, just to be on the safe side, I don't know. You could do that. There's nothing that would prevent you from doing that. It's still a lot of work, though, and I have to explain that it's not simple. The Let's Go Washington people may be making it look simple, but it is not. So, Jason, why does Smack Daddy Dow Constantine always have this constipated look on his face? Probably because the guy is a walking corruption factory, and the Democrats who know all of the stories about him, have held it over his head, and that's why he's not running for governor right now. And he is stuck in the position that he currently holds as a county executive in King County, because that's about as far as they're going to let him go. And, it's these guys usually aspire for more, and when they can't get there, they're usually disappointed about that. Arsenio, you got a question here, and Tumwater stated that change the public spaces ordinance we brought up again in January 2024 after a work group. Essentially, it was tabled for further consideration. Arsenio, it's good to know. I may try to get up there and engage on that one because it's close enough to my house, and I appreciate it. It's a stupid policy if that's the one they're going to go down. Corrine Martin had a question. Do you know if all voting machines were certified primary to 2020 in Washington State? In fact, some of them were not. That is a fact. So I know that some of them were not certified. Rob, you got a question here. Hi, Glenn. What are your thoughts about the Spokane mayor outcome with Lisa Brown? Well, okay. Let me tell you what I think about that one. Yeah, Lisa Brown's a total nightmare. Former Department of Commerce secretary under Inslee, former state senator out of Spokane. and now she's the mayor. And of course, her entire tenure, because she'd run against Kathy McMorris Rodgers and lost in the for a Congress seat a couple years ago. I can't remember the actual year that happened that she lost, but she lost a fairly well-funded federal effort. Lisa Brown's just plain corrupt. I mean, she's a corruption crew, and she's going to be in there with a bunch of her corruption crony friends, and they're going to be basically kicking cash out in Spokane and trying to be as close to Seattle as they possibly can with their policies. Part of the reason for this is that they need to fund their political support. They're going to have to import as many drug addicts as they can, and they need to increase the crime level, hopefully discourage conservatives from living there. And so they'll be walking this point and they got to grift a lot of cash to their friends. And so she'll be probably recycling some of her Department of Commerce grants, making sure that conveniently the beneficiaries of those grants get the money, and then that money gets recycled back to her. That's how it works. I don't know why people in Spokane don't think that they're going to be subject to the same exact stupid ideas that I hear them complain about on the west side when it's happening right there. And for you who moved to Idaho, there's nothing good about this scenario either, because these are leftists there, and there's no such thing as a border to them. They're just going to try to export all their bad ideas into Idaho. And Idaho has some particularly weak and ineffective Republicans who seem to run that place and have no idea what's coming their way, and they think that because they're called Republican that somehow they're safe. They just seem to be delusional. Every time I talk to these Republicans in Idaho, I'm fairly convinced that the Republican leadership there has no idea what's coming. And Spokane is right next door to Coeur d'Alene, and it's real close. I just drove through there the other day. So that's a terrible election result. You had this where they rejected the jail to build a jail in the county that lost. At the same time, they passed an ordinance in the city that said that the police should be able to remove homeless camps that are right next to schools and other kind of critical places. She's not going to enforce that. Lisa Brown won't enforce that at all. I would predict that things will get a lot worse when it comes to crime and enforcement of crime in the city of Spokane. So I'm sorry to say, just make sure that you know how to use your firearm, you're able to defend yourself, and be prepared for a little bit tougher road for a while at Spokane and the surrounding areas until you get some people there who just aren't totally and absolutely irredeemably corrupt. And right now you got a majority who are on that council. It's not a good scene. So I'm sorry for that, but that's just a terrible situation. Let's see. Okay, you had a question here, Corning, about does that not make the votes null and void if the machines were not certified? And the answer has historically come back and said no. They still will say that the votes count because they've created very narrow windows in which you would challenge anything or could challenge anything. In fact, they've actually created such narrow windows that nobody would ever realistically have any way of challenging an election because the machines were not certified. So even though that's a law, they're just going to ignore it. Let's see, Jason, what is the argument against permit to purchase for firearms? And the argument is the same as requiring a concealed carry permit. I don't know if I know exactly what you're asking there. But I generally believe that, I've generally believed anyway that the concealed carry permit process, if it's a shell issue process like what we have in our states, probably a pretty good system. It's not bad. It maybe could be better. Permitless carry is allowed now in a large number of states in America. It'd be nice if Washington went there. But even if it didn't, the shell issue element of Washington State's concealed carry permit made us actually kind of a front runner in the whole concealed carry dynamics. That was unusual and unique back in the 80s when it was first implemented. So it might have been implemented earlier than that, actually. I should go back and double check my history on that. I just remember it because of family members getting permits to carry in the 80s. So that was my first when I was a kid. So I remember that a bit at the time. I don't like the idea of having any kind of permits at all involved in the purchase of firearms. I think that's a terrible idea and a terrible process to go down, and obviously it creates the logical slippery slope argument, which have been arguing about and has been proven true time and time again by our political class. That if you give them an opportunity, they're going to find ways of trying to restrict our ability to defend ourselves and to protect ourselves from criminals. They seem to prefer you to be a victim, and they right now, certainly the Democrats love criminals for whatever reason. That's their primary growth constituency that I think they see for their future. So they love criminals, they like crime. It seems to be something they thrive on. And you can see that pretty much everywhere that they're in, crime does seem to be a dominant feature of their landscape. Anyway, so there's a lot of challenges that we face. A lot of good things are coming up. You'll see some of my videos, and I encourage you to take a look at them. I'm hoping to launch this next one tomorrow, just about the reason why the left is melting down. I'm hoping that I've explained that adequately, that it's obvious as to why there's such a significant impact with these initiatives. There is a tendency to be very jaded about the political process, especially if you get close to it and you understand it well, and you understand the players well. And that, I think, that jaded nature of how we view the political process is okay. It can be healthy at times, but it also tends to turn some people into not being involved in the process, and that's the wrong message to take. I think you need to be honest and clear about what you're dealing with, where you live, but I don't think it's a good idea to simply turn that into some kind of your familiarity with the corruption, nature of man, and all the other issues that we tend to deal with, and then turn that into some kind of a reason to not be engaged or involved. That would be a mistake. One of the things I'll try to talk about in future, and we're kind of coming to a close here on today's live stream, but I'm going to try to address this, and you can remind me if you have any questions when you want to bring it up here. But I do want to try to address some of my plans with Let's Go, or with We the Governed, and then watching what Let's Go Washington does next year. But with We the Governed, I really want to talk about some of my plans on some of the corruption investigations that I've been involved in, improving the article and distribution of the media a little bit that I'm doing, as well as my transition on the Parallel channel and Rumble, as well as some of the other activities that I've been involved in, especially the training, which I hope to do a bunch of this next year with anybody out there in Washington State who wants to be trained to be more effective activists. And hopefully you're interested in becoming more effective, and hopefully you believe I can help you, and I'd like to come out and do so if I can. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for being on this live stream tonight. There's always a lot going on, always a lot of good questions. You guys had a lot of good questions. So I hope to see you next week, roughly around the same time, I believe. And we will hopefully have a lot more to talk about then. Watch these two videos coming up. If you got friends that need to subscribe, make sure they subscribe to this channel. Don't forget to do that below. Hit like and share this with others if you find it useful. Maybe they will as well. So with that, guys, thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.